All right, so this is chapter 12. This chapter is called Manifest Destiny, and it focuses mainly on the concept of manifest destiny, but also as it applies to the Mexican War. And as we'll see, the Mexican War is not only significant because of the land acquisition that we got as a result of the war, but also as a step towards the Civil War, which we will see how that plays out. All right, so the concept, the term of manifest destiny gets its name because of an essay written by John Lewis O'Sullivan, who was a popular editor and columnist at the time. He had an essay printed in the U.S. Magazine and Democratic Review, and that he expressed the American belief in the God-given mission of the United States to lead the world to democracy. And as such, he outlined specifically the importance of annexing Texas to the United States as part of that mission, that we're going to be this beacon of democracy to the rest of the world. And in order to do that, we need to first expand our territory and thus bring democracy to those territories. And you can see a really big parallel here with the idea of American exceptionalism that we talked about back when we talked about the Puritans. We talked about John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill, where all the eyes of the world were going to be upon this Puritan settlement. And that's a belief that has been transformed into a common belief that many people in America had, that we are, and it's still present today, that we are in some way special, and that we in some way are going to show the rest of the world how to live and how to be. So according to O'Sullivan, he viewed the annexing of Texas as extremely important, and he viewed expansion in general as necessary to achieve America's destiny and to protect American interests. So you can see there's this kind of quasi-religious call, right? It's not just something that we should do for practical reasons. There's a spiritual element to it as well. Like it's a God-given destiny to govern this land from sea to shining sea. And so because of this, manifest destiny is grounded in the belief that the democratic agrarian republic that America has been up until this point will save the world. So again, manifest destiny is given its name in 1845, but prior to this, it was a very widely held but vaguely defined belief that had been around since the founding of the nation, and it's never really gone away. We just didn't have a term, like a name to give to it. So what is manifest destiny all about? Well, first, many Americans believed in the strength of our values and our institutions and believed that this in some way justified our moral claims to leadership around the world. It also included the idea that lands west of the Mississippi River were destined for American-led political and agricultural improvement. So again, we're not just going in and taking over this land, we're going to improve it. This land needs our particular brand of government and lifestyle to improve it. And 3, that God in the Constitution ordained this destiny to accomplish the redemption and democratization throughout the world. And these beliefs, as nice as they sound, were really disastrous to anyone standing in the way of our concept of manifest destiny as we. So a political movement that really strove to see manifest destiny through came to be known as the Young America movement. And it was strongest among the Democrats at the time, but really it spanned the political spectrum. There were people from the existing Whig Party at the time who also were part of this. And these people tended to downplay the divisions within America over slavery and ethnicity, and instead embraced a national unity that emphasized American exceptionalism. Again, we're special, we're exceptional. Expansion, and democratic participation and economic interdependence. We're all regions working together for the common good of the nation. And this image over here to the right is probably the most famous image of manifest destiny. You can see the angel leading the settlers west, bringing in the light, driving out the darkness. And what is represented by the light and the darkness? Well, in the darkness, which of course has negative connotations, we're driving out Native Americans and the native way of life. And in the light, we're bringing in, as we see it, progress. Railway lines, telegraph lines, settlers, farming. And again, it's this idea that we're destined to own this land because we're destined to make it better. And so that's what this image is encapsulating, that this belief that we have a right to this land so that we can improve it. But not everybody approved of this. Many Americans disapproved of this very aggressive approach to expansion. They believed that the rhetoric of the Young America movement represented a kind of imperialism that the American Revolution had repudiated. Because remember, we had been a part of an imperial nation, meaning a mother country with colonies. So we're not necessarily saying go out and get colonies, but we are looking for new territories. And so that kind of goes against our founding principles. And many members of the Whig Party, which later largely became the Republican Party, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, really argued against that. They believed that it was the United States' mission to lead the world by example, not by conquest. So not saying that our ways aren't the best, but saying rather we should show the world that our ways are the best through the way we live our life and not necessarily by going out and imposing it on others. So Abraham Lincoln had this quote about the Young American movement, and if you can't tell, it is very sarcastic, very tongue-in-cheek. So he's not meaning it. He's being sarcastic. That's his intention. He, meaning Young American, owns a large part of the world, but right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it. He is a great friend of humanity, and this desire for land is not selfish, but merely an impulse to extend the area of freedom. However, Lincoln and other anti-expansionists really struggled to win popular opinion. The nation continued to move west, and while doing so, they battled native people and foreign nations, as we're going to talk about in a second here with the Mexican War. And all of this came at a cost, the biggest of which is it's going to exacerbate the slavery question. As we acquire new territories, the heart of the issue is, what about slavery? We have these territories. Do we allow slavery or do we not allow slavery? And this in turn pushes us towards civil war as we are unable to answer that question as a nation. And on top of that, it threatened the mission of American democracy it was designed to aid. Had the Civil War turned out different, that would have been the end of the nation, the end of everything that this was supposed to see fulfilled. So again, as we move west, we told the Native Americans after the Trail of Tears that they would be located west of the Mississippi River and given new lands there where they would be allowed to rebuild. And many of them do slowly rebuild, and many actually achieve quite a bit of prosperity. Some groups were too powerful to move. For example, the Comanche in the Southern Plains region of the southwest of the United States. But the federal government often attempted more than relocation. And really they get into more of this in the second part of this class, American History 1877 to the present, when they talk about more of the quote-unquote attempts to civilize the Native Americans, for instance, by establishing schools. The Civilization Fund Act passed by Congress in 1819 allocated $10,000 to different missionaries to establish schools. And that really gets underway later on in history. Western settlers moving west of the Mississippi tended to migrate as families. They usually settled along navigable and potable rivers, meaning potable means you can drink the water. Settlements coalesced also around local traditions. People tended to move in groups. So if you were from a particular town or city, you would go where others from your particular town and city were going, just because it's familiar to you and you might know these people, and it just makes the move easier in a similar way to which many groups who immigrate to the United States tend to live in neighborhoods in which other people from their country of origin lives. It just makes the transition smoother. And these shared understandings encouraged a sense of cooperation that was very much needed in the West. Now, what the West means has definitely changed over time. Before the Mexican War, most Americans viewed the West as the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And because of soil exhaustion and competition for land in the East, there's a great encouragement for, again, Western expansion. And the U.S. government encouraged perceptions of the West as a land of hard-won opportunity. You're going to go out there and you're going to recreate the frontier, and this is going to be a time of very personal and national bounty for anybody who's going to move west. But after the Mexican War, the concept of West is obviously going to change because we're going to acquire new Western lands. Women migrants often had a double burden. So things are not just hard because you're a pioneer, they're hard because you're a woman. Number one, the travel, of course, is very difficult. And two, while also traveling and enduring hardships on the frontier, you still are expected to conform to gender norms. However, there is some more of a sense of openness in frontier society. There's modestly more opportunities for women, just because husbands need partners to set up a homestead, and that's not an easy thing to do in the middle of nowhere. So suitable wives who are able to or willing to, we should say, undertake this are in short supply, not surprisingly. And so as a result of this, some women are able to informally negotiate more power within their relationships because of that. Not a lot of people are willing to take on the tasks, such as this woman in the picture is doing, of gathering cow pies to be burned as fuel. So, yeah, able to get a little bit more out of the relationship, modestly. Now, Americans debated the role that the government should play in westward expansion. And the question really centered on who should pay for the internal improvements needed to encourage more people to come west. So specifically things like roads, railroads, canals, etc. Some see the West as a frontier driven by private risk and investment, and so they don't really need a government interference. If you want to take a risk and build a railway line west, where there really isn't anybody now, and then there's a boom and a lot of people move out there and they use your railway and you become rich, that's great. It should be very much capitalistic, driven by private investment. Others see that the federal government has a strong role in providing the infrastructure needed for private investment. And in the end, federal aid does prove to be essential to conquest and settlement of the West. Again, new roads and canals are needed to help people move west. The rise of steamboats are going to help people use canals, and railways, definitely. I mean, if you're going to go out and you're going to farm in the West, but there's no real way for you to get your crops to any kind of a market quickly, your crops are going to go, they're going to go bad, or the livestock that you're going to sell. I mean, you can't. It just doesn't make any sense, and so you need that infrastructure in order to make it work. First, for you to actually travel to get there, and secondly, for you to make a go of it as any kind of business owner, but especially as a farmer. And so these transportation networks are obviously very important. And the economic interdependence of the nation, therefore, is going to stretch over hundreds of miles. So Manifest Destiny is wedded to this idea of territorial expansion and continued economic development, which they would have saw as an improvement for this area. Okay. So the territorial expansion that we're going to be focusing on specifically comes as a result of the annexation of Texas and the Mexican War, which follows after it. All right, so Texas first belonged to Spain. It was first a Spanish territory, and then it became a Mexican territory after 1821. And not a lot of people lived there. And so Mexico wanted more people to settle in the territory of Texas, and so they gave incentives to settlers from the United States to come and settle there. They gave them generous land grants at pretty low prices. However, in return, American settlers had to agree to convert to Catholicism and apply to become citizens of Mexico. And by 1830, there were 30,000 people living in Texas, 90% of whom were Anglo-Americans. So these incentives obviously worked. However, very quickly thereafter, there was a lot of friction between the settlers and the Mexican government, mainly because the settlers didn't do the two things they were supposed to. They didn't convert, and they didn't apply to citizenship. Additionally, many of the settlers who came to Texas were Southerners, because it just makes sense. Texas is in the South. Southerners looking for new land to grow cotton, of course. And they come and they bring slaves with them. Well, in 1830, the Mexican government outlawed any new slaves being brought into this territory. And as a result, Americans could no longer settle in Texas. Well, the Texans then rebel. Again, 90% of the people living there are Anglo-Americans. So they don't take this lightly, and they rebel and declare their independence on March 2nd, 1836. Their rebellion lasts less than 2 months. The settlers do face a famous defeat at the Alamo. However, they very quickly regroup and destroy the Mexican army and are able to establish, on questionable grounds, their independence. So the Mexican government does not accept the independence of Texas, but regardless, Sam Houston is elected the president of the Republic of Texas in October of 1836. And very quickly, Houston moves to apply to become an American state. And most Texans want to join the United States, want to become a state in the U.S. However, many Americans opposed Texas's annexation, which again would be Texas becoming a state. The Texas Constitution allowed slavery. That was the main issue. In the North, anti-slavery Whigs opposed another slave state being added to the Union and upsetting the balance. Others also worried that this would provoke a war with Mexico, because again, the Mexican government did not accept the independence of Texas. And so had the United States accepted Texas as a state, then that would have the possibility of provoking war with Mexico, which does indeed happen. So initially there is resistance to admitting Texas as a state. President Jackson resisted it. He feared a prolonged debate over another slave state. He felt that it would become a very divisive issue and would cost the Democrats the presidential election, and so he overall postponed it. Even though Jackson himself was a slave owner and a supporter of slavery, he didn't see this as an issue worth having at the time. So, the annexation of Texas and the territorial expansion of the United States become the key issues in a later presidential election. Much like a lot of the issues surrounding slavery, these politicians in charge just kick the can down the road, as it were. Well, I don't know how to solve this problem, so I'm just going to ignore it and let some other generation of people deal with it. And deal with it they do, as we know in the Civil War. So the Whigs in this presidential election nominate Henry Clay, who refused to support Texas's annexation. And the Democrats nominated James K. Polk, who was all for the annexation of Texas, and he asserted America's right to all of Oregon, which we'll get to in a second, and the purchase of California. He used Manifest Destiny as an argument to justify annexing Texas, claiming Oregon, purchasing California, and displacing all Native American tribes in these territories. And he is able to narrowly win the Congress then approves of Texas's annexation as the 28th state in the United States. And they then look at the issue of Oregon first. So both the United States and Great Britain claim the Oregon Territory. And at the time, Polk's campaign had a slogan called 54-40 or fight, meaning, if you look at the map over here on the right, you can see the 54-40 line. The United States would go to war to get the entire Oregon Territory. Well, that doesn't happen. Despite those strong words, Polk proposes a compromise to divide Oregon at the 49th parallel, which the British accept. And we get everything to the south, and they get everything to the north. So, although he is able to avoid a war with Great Britain, war is brewing on our southern border with Mexico. Mexico breaks off diplomatic relations with the United States, angered by our annexation of Texas, which, of course, again, they don't believe to be an independent nation. Polk then worsens the tensions with Mexico by supporting Texas's claim to the Rio Grande as the southwest border of that state. And on April 25, 1846, a large Mexican force crossed the Rio Grande River and attacked a small group of the American army. 11 were killed, and the rest were wounded or captured. And because of this action, Polk demanded war, which was declared on May 13, 1846. Many people opposed this war. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people in the Northeast, especially abolitionists, opposed this war. They felt it was an unjust conflict designed to expand slavery into new territories, since the territories we would be winning from Mexico would all be in the South. For example, Henry David Thoreau wrote a very famous essay called the Civil Disobedience Essay, in which he urged passive resistance to unjust laws. And this is going to be an essay that directly influences Dr. King's approach to the civil rights movement later on in history, about 100 years later. Whig leaders also opposed this war. A young congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln challenged Polk to identify the exact spot where American blood had been spilled, his famous Spots Resolution, because he believed that Polk was using this small skirmish as an excuse to launch this large-scale war, and again, that it was all a pretense to just expand slavery. The war goes very well and very quickly for the American Army. Overall control is given to General Zachary Taylor. He wins a series of victories in northeast Mexico and becomes a hero as a result of it, and of course later on president. Some forces are also led by Stephen W. Kearny, and they are able to capture Santa Fe and secure California. And led by General Winfield Scott, U.S. forces are going to land in Veracruz, battle their way to Mexico City, and take the capital on September 14th, 1847. So it's a very quick war, and a treaty is quickly agreed upon, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico lost a third of their territory. They ceded all of New Mexico and California. New Mexico doesn't just mean present-day New Mexico. It also included all of present-day Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. So that's a lot. The United States gained more than 500,000 miles of new territory. In return, we agreed to pay Mexico $15 million and also pay all claims that American citizens had against the Mexican government. But definitely we made out very well as a result of this treaty. So what are the consequences of this very short war? Well, quite a bit. Number one, it gave some real battle experience to a young group of junior officers who are going to become pretty famous as a result of the Civil War, including Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, both of whom served in the Mexican War. It also made the United States a continental nation. We now officially span from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic to Pacific. And the big one, it added a lot of territories, which made for an increasingly bitter debate over the extension of slavery. As we're going to see in the next chapter, this pretty much defines the next couple of years. And it is a key step in the road to war. After this, there are going to be a rush of settlers moving west, eventually, particularly in California. Initially, not a lot of people wanted to settle in California, which is ironic considering it is now our most populous state. Mainly, it's 3 months travel to the nearest American settlement, and Oregon had a lot more fertile soil. So initially, Oregon attracted more settlers. So for example, by 1848, there were 20,000 Americans west of the Rockies, 3/4 of which were in Oregon. However, all that changes when on January 24th, 1848, a man by the name of James W. Marshall discovered gold in the Sacramento Valley. Everybody loves a rich, quick scheme, and so lots of people start flooding into California in the gold rush. And this influx of a very diverse group of people created a very combative atmosphere. I mean, it truly was the Wild West out in California as a result of this. There were a lot of Chinese and Mexican immigrants living in California at this time as well. And the competition for land, resources, and riches amongst these different groups further individual and collective abuses, particularly against Native Americans and older Mexican communities. So, to conclude, the debates over expansion, economics, diplomacy, and manifest destiny reveal weaknesses within our country. Whereas at the same time, new methods of transportation, communication, and the rise of an international market economy and the growth of the frontier helped Americans reaffirm their national character. But again, the big takeaway that's going to lead us into this next chapter is, what do we do about these newly acquired lands? Are they free or are they slave?